Welcome everyone. This is a conference put on by Colorado 9/11 Truth, and we have an invited guest tonight, and that is Richard Behan, or Behan, actually you say it, right? I have a little bit of bio about him, a little bit of background. So he's the author of an upcoming book called Fraud and Apocalypse, the backstory of George Bush's global war on terrorism. And it's going to be published by Ryan Grimm's Strong Arm Press. You may know Ryan Grimm from The Intercept. Much of our focus has been on the physical evidence at the World Trade Center that proves 9/11 was an orchestrated event that took high-level planning and preparation. Richard Behan's work comes from a different angle. He gives us a peek behind the curtain in the months leading up to 9/11. Richard his research is entirely based on publicly available documents. Without the backstory, we don't have the full story. So for bio, Richard earned a PhD at UC Berkeley and professor of public policy at Northern Arizona University and University of Montana. He's author of Plundered Promise, Capitalism, Politics, and the Fate of Federal Lands back in 2001. In retirement and enraged at the Bush administration's war on terrorism, he authored 60 anti-war essays for the websites Common Dreams, Ultranet, Counterpunch, After Downing Street, American Herald Tribune, Op-Ed News, and several others. He was participating in Code Pink's People's Tribunal on the Iraq War in 2016, and he was encouraged to summarize his work in book form. And so he decided to do that, and he's pretty much finished with the manuscript for Fraud and Apocalypse. I first became aware of Richard when he sent me a private copy of his upcoming manuscript to review and hopefully make comments about and so forth. And I'm one of a number of people he asked to do that. And I was very impressed that this is a big part of the story that we have been telling, but it's from a different angle than what we've been telling. So, Richard,
yes, sir.
Can you give us a synopsis of your book in 3 sentences or less? Just give us a little overview here.
That was the deal I was trying to cut, David, but Marty sent me a different question. He said, what is your main premise? And that kind of freed me from the 3-sentence limitation.
All right, so you use as many sentences as you need. Okay, there you go.
I think I can do this pretty quickly. Long before 9/11, George Bush was committed to 2 unprovoked wars of invasion and occupation. Both would be international crimes. The first war the first war they declared in time, so to speak, was invading Iraq. And the objective there was to provide preemptive access to the Iraqi oil fields for 2 American oil companies and 2 British companies. Now, the Afghanistan situation was a little different. The objective there was to secure a right-of-way for a pipeline across Afghanistan for the Unocal Corporation, an American oil company. 9/11 was pivotal. These commitments, let me repeat that, these commitments to invade those countries were made long before 9/11. So when 9/11 came along, it was a pivotal opportunity. And he chose that opportunity to disguise his 2 wars by combining them into the single war that we know as the war on terrorism. That's the fraud part of my title. If it was to be a war on terrorism, there had to be terrorists alive, at large, and in residence in those 2 countries. Now, he needed to be certain about that. So here's the way he did it. He assured this in the Afghanistan situation by refusing a standing offer from the Taliban to assassinate Osama bin Laden, or to surrender him into U.S. custody. He refused that offer 4 times prior to 9/11 and once thereafter. Then he attacked Afghanistan. In the Iraqi situation, he assured that there would be a terrorist alive, at large, and in residence by refusing an offer from Saddam Hussein to enter voluntary exile in Saudi Arabia, Egypt, or Turkey. Shortly after that refusal, Bush attacked Iraq. 19 years later, his intended wars are epic failures. There is no remote prospect of an American pipeline traversing Afghanistan. The Iraqi oil fields are dominated by Chinese and Russian oil companies. But 801,000 people have died in violence. 21 million more wander the globe as refugees. And $6.4 trillion have been squandered. That is the apocalypse. And his fraudulent war continues with no sight in end. No end in sight, excuse me about that. And that's the synopsis. A little more than 3 sentences, David, but there it is.
A little more. Yeah, that's fine. Okay. What is it that you have drawn upon? You said you had public sources. What are your primary sources for this book?
Could I combine that with a question that it implies?
That's fine. You can do whatever, you can answer whatever question you want. I'll ask what I want, and you can answer whatever you want.
Doesn't that question imply, is the story true?
Yeah. I was going to ask that down the line, but there you go. Is the story true?
Yeah, I'd like to address that. I'm responsible for discovering none of the information in the book, not a single word of it. Every element, as David suggested, of this story was found in the public domain. It is entirely the work of other people. My job was tedious, but not difficult. I simply assembled the parts. The book is a work of construction, not of discovery, and certainly not of creation. First, the 54 books in my reference bibliography are written by distinguished authors and published by established publishers. There is one exception, and it's a very important one, but the information in the unpublished book is confirmed in other and multiple sources. Probably 2/3 of the information in the book I found on the internet. A worldwide universe of information, instantly retrievable at trivial cost. This is an astonishing tool of scholarly inquiry. The book literally could not have been put together without the internet sources and certainly without the search engines. So the book is the story dozens and dozens of people have told, written in small but interlocking installments. It is truly their story, not mine. Their work is cited in 179 footnotes from magazines and newspapers, from US, British, Israeli, Canadian, Irish, Maltese, and Pakistani sources. A German trade journal, university research papers, government agencies' reports, congressional record, and on and on and on. So I must say this about credibility. Is the book true? I collated and transcribed a story written by dozens of other people. To deny the story totally, to say the book is false, to say it is not true, every one of these other authors must be discredited. I tell the story that I found, and I'm confident it is true.
Okay. One of the things that came up in my mind when I was reading through this is you're talking about the Taliban basically acting cooperative with the United States. The message that we got through the mainstream media was that the Taliban was somehow our enemies, and so I know there was one big campaign. One of my friends was very turned off on the Taliban, primarily on all the stuff that was published about how they mistreated women, all those kinds of issues, which in my sense was that that's part of a propaganda effort to discredit them. However, the question arises, what was our relationship going into the Bush administration? What was our relationship with the Taliban, and why were they interested in turning over bin Laden?
The U.S., David, was very instrumental in helping the Taliban repulse the Russian invasion. And they were very, very grateful about that. And they wanted very, very much to maintain that cordial relationship with the U.S. Bin Laden had bombed 2 embassies in Africa. And
American embassies.
American embassies, yes. And that was a grave embarrassment to the Taliban. A year later, bin Laden bombed the USS Cole in the port of Aden. And that was an embarrassment to the Taliban. So in order to maintain this cordial relationship with the U.S., they were willing either to, well, it's a kind of a complicated story, but let's keep it simple for now. They were willing either to assassinate bin Laden or to extradite him to the U.S. custody.
What I recall from I'm just sort of coming back with the kind of picture that just representative here of a member of the public who is sort of trying to follow this. I remember seeing on television about a group of Taliban meeting in Texas with the Bushes, or at least with American diplomats. And they were this was after 9/11, and they were talking about turning over bin Laden, but it was if you could show us some evidence. In other words, it was almost like they were reluctant to turn him over, but they were wanting, but let's say, show us some evidence that he did 9/11. And based on that, I mean, that seemed to be the way that was all portrayed. What you're showing here is a much deeper story where there was a more long-standing issue where the Taliban was really interested in turning him over much earlier. So can you somehow untangle some of that?
Well, I guess first we need to make it very, very clear that the offer of surrender or assassination was on George Bush's desk on January 20th, 2001, when he took office. So this predates 9/11, of course, by 9 months. Well, what, 7 months, 8 months. Now, as to your question about the Taliban asking for evidence of 9/11, and there were some meetings. There was one meeting after 9/11. The offer was still in effect. And that exchange that you mentioned, David, that the Taliban wanted proof of bin Laden's culpability in 9/11, that took place. But it took place in a very, very complicated and convoluted conversation that is recorded in this one unpublished book that I mentioned. They didn't stay on that stance for very long. As a matter of fact, they were kind of outraged because the evidence that was provided was newspaper stories. And they thought that was pretty flimsy evidence. So there is that kind of a complicating issue in there. But if the conversation, and it took place in Pakistan on the 15th of September, 2001, this last meeting. And when you read the whole transcript, so to speak, you'll see that that was kind of a sideline issue. It might have been a bluff. It's hard to tell. But certainly the evidence is overwhelming that they were anxious to get bin Laden out of the way. Okay. Or as they put it, he was a rock in the road to very good relationships between the two countries, and they wanted to remove the rock.
That was what I was about to ask. What was their reason for wanting to deal with? It seemed like that Osama bin Laden was some kind of a thorn in the side, as you say, a rock in the road kind of a thing. I think you actually, in our conversations, you had a more picturesque term that they actually used for Osama. Why don't you share that with everyone here?
Yes, they called him the snake. The
Yeah.
snake, yes.
So, in other words, Osama bin Laden was not a friend of the Taliban.
No, he was not.
So, how was it that, this is just out of curiosity, how was it that Osama bin Laden was in Afghanistan?
Well, I don't have a lot of information on that, David. I didn't dig into that very far, but my recollection was he left Saudi Arabia outraged at the installation of U.S. forces and U.S. bases in Arabia, and took up residence in Afghanistan, I guess, as a congenial place.
Uh-huh. So I know he was presumably on the CIA payroll during the Russian battles. I just wondered if maybe he was just there continuously ever since that, or if this was anyway, I just was curious. So you don't have, you didn't do any direct
No, I didn't
into that. Yeah. Okay. A lot of your upcoming manuscript focuses on this Afghani man, an Afghani American, who was actually the go-between from the Bush administration to the Taliban. And that seemed like a very significant subplot of all of this. And I don't know at what point, would you like to give us a sense of what that was all about?
Certainly.
He had a lot to say about this.
Very much. His name was Kabir Mohabbat, and he had been a freedom fighter against the Russians. He was born in Afghanistan, was educated in university in Oklahoma. His family was very well regarded, how would you put this, a part, so to speak, of the upper echelons of power in Afghanistan. Well, I don't want to get the story too complicated here, but he was interested in developing an oil refinery in Afghanistan. So he traveled in Afghanistan quite a bit on business matters. He was there when the embassies in Africa were bombed. And he took a call from a high-ranking member of the Taliban, and they said, they offered at that point, they said, what are we going to do with bin Laden? We've tried all kinds of things. We've tried to deport him. That doesn't work. And Kabir Mohabbat asked the Taliban, can I have him? And they said, dead or alive. So this is in 2000, it would have been when?
This was before the Bush administration, or
yes,
beginning?
It was during the Clinton administration. So it's in the late 1900s. So Mohabbat immediately called the State Department in Washington and spoke to a fellow named Michael something. It's in the book. I've forgotten his last name. And said, how do you want bin Laden? Rare, medium, or well done? And he also spoke to a friend of his who was Assistant Secretary of State at the time and made the same offer to her. And he never heard anything more about that. And the woman resigned in protest to some other issues of anti-terrorism. So it's a little murky and muddy in there, but certainly in the late, I guess it was 1998, the State Department at least was well informed of the antipathy with which the Taliban held Osama bin Laden. Now, fast forward to the bombing of the USS Cole in November of 1999. Excuse me, 2000, sure, the election. The State Department called Mohabbat and asked him to go to Afghanistan and talk to the Taliban and give them this message. You will be bombed into the Stone Age if we can't have Osama bin Laden. Now here's kind of a peculiar set of circumstances. Here's the government, the Clinton administration, asking for bin Laden, and the deal was cut to do that. Now the deal was cut at the Sheraton Hotel in Berlin in late November of 2000. Now recall, it passed after the election. And at the time, Bush and Gore were battling it out in court to see who would be president. Now, I had some inclinations about this in my reading, so I can't document this. But what I think happened was this, that Clinton realized that the apprehension or the capture of taking custody of bin Laden would have an enormous amount of political capital attached to it. It'd be quite the heroic thing. Now, he's at the end of his term. He doesn't need any political capital. But his vice president, Al Gore, could certainly use it. So that's why I think they postponed the decision.
Well, on the assumption that Gore was going to win.
Yes, right. So in any case, the deal didn't take place during the Clinton administration. It was put off until George Bush took office. And from there, the story takes on an entirely different cast.
Mm-hmm.
Did that get your question answered?
Yeah.
Okay.
So the whole Taliban connection with wanting to get bin Laden out of the way was literally that they wanted a good relation with the U.S. It was not that they were being antagonistic to the U.S. in any way.
That's at least fit.
Yeah. And
very, very anxious to maintain the relationship.
I think that's...
They also didn't want to be bombed back to the Stone Age.
Of course.
That was a pretty good incentive, yeah.
Okay. One of the things that's a curiosity to me that I have never understood is Afghanistan. What the heck is there in Afghanistan to bomb? I mean, it's like here is this basically a deserted landscape for the most part with little village structures and a few small cities. And how in the world could this kind of a war be a protracted thing that would be our longest war when it seems like it could have been over in a month or two?
Well, there's a couple things to be said about that. It very well could have been over in a month or two because the Taliban did offer unconditional surrender, including total disarmament, on December 5th, 2001.
Before 2002 even kicked in.
Yes. Yeah. So, once again, Bush declined that offer. He refused to accept victory in the war on terrorism. But let's get back to that a little bit later, if it makes sense. David, you probably wouldn't be very happy to know that your curiosity about what is there to bomb in Afghanistan was shared very, very strongly by Donald Rumsfeld. Mm-hmm. And this we know from the meeting at Camp David that took place shortly after 9/11 in deciding what to do. Now, the neocons, the members, the card-carrying members of the program Project for the New American Century, PNAC, led by Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld, wanted very, very much to attack Iraq after 9/11.
Now, it sounded like before 9/11.
No, this is after 9/11.
Okay, but they were, all right, well, all right, go ahead.
And Rumsfeld's argument was Iraq is so target poor. Afghanistan is so target poor, and Iraq is so target rich. So there you are. And I can't tell you why. Well, certainly I can't. Why did we attack them anyway? Why did we bomb them? There wasn't much to bomb, but there was very, very much to be gained. And that is the pipeline across Afghanistan for the UNICAL.
And so what happened with that? Do we have such a pipeline?
Not today, but we came very close.
I heard a report that all of our military bases in Afghanistan were lined up right along the pipeline route, like that was very blatantly our objective there. So
that was noticed in an Israeli newspaper that first pointed that out, that the bases paralleled the route of the pipeline. In February of 2002, Hamid Karzai and Musharraf, the president of Pakistan, signed an agreement to build the pipeline. It would go through Pakistan as well to get to the coast. So the way was open for Unocal, and 4 agencies of the U.S. government were pledged to finance the pipeline. But of course, the war was going on. Bush did not accept the surrender. The fighting continued, and nobody wants to build a pipeline in a war zone. Now that's the short answer.
Mm-hmm.
No,
okay.
There's no pipeline today.
Because you mentioned a few minutes ago that the resources, maybe it was just the oil, but maybe the gas as well, is actually being more controlled by other foreign companies rather than the originally intended companies. Is that something you said, or did I mishear you?
Well, we're having some kind of a time lapse thing here,
okay.
David.
Go ahead and put it. Put it in the correct context so that you can lay it out here.
Today, in 2020, Russian and Chinese oil companies have the bulk of the contracts for the Iraqi oil. The 4 companies I mentioned were to be the beneficiaries, but it didn't happen that way.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a complicated story there too. Yeah.
Go ahead. That's why we're here.
The story is, in 2002, a year before the Iraqi invasion was undertaken, the State Department undertook a study of post-war Iraq. And this is about 9 months before the war in Iraq was even authorized. The State Department was studying what to do with it after. And what they intended to do was to privatize the oil of Iraq. And these 4 companies were to be the beneficiaries. Now, it's a lot of detail here, but the mechanism was to be a contract called a production sharing agreement. And production sharing agreements are very, very appropriate for a poor country with no development yet. And they sign a contract with a foreign oil company. And the oil company will build all the infrastructure. They'll drill the wells, they'll lay the pipelines, they'll develop the terminals at the seaports, all the storage facilities, in exchange for which they get up to 75% of the oil free. Those were the contracts that were being built into the hydrocarbon law that was written in English, then translated into Arabic, and then sent to the Iraqi parliament after the war. The Iraqi parliament had never seen the law before. It was written by a contractor called Bearing Point, and they never seen it. So at first they had to study it, and then they didn't like it. Especially, there was a great chasm between what you might call the Baghdad Iraq and the Kurdish Iraq. And there's a lot of oil in the Kurdish part of the country. And they couldn't agree on much of anything. And so the law languished and languished and languished, and was never passed. Much later, after the war, after the things settled down, they did let contracts to foreign oil companies to develop Iraqi oil, most of which went to Chinese and Russian companies. There's a couple of American companies there, but they're just a tiny fraction. I list this in the book. There's 8 or 10 different countries that have contracts to develop and exploit Iraqi oil. But the bulk of it goes to the Chinese and the Russians.
Okay, I think let's go ahead and open it up. Let me give you first a chance. Are there some topics that you consider major points of information that I've failed to bring in front of you here? Are there some things that you want to communicate before we just have a free-for-all question and answer?
Well, thank you for the invitation, David, but I don't think so. What I wanted very much to do was to get the sweep of my book very well understood, and I think we've taken care of that.
Okay.
And I wanted very much to defend the credibility of the book, its veracity.
I wanted to say the book is not very long. It's under 100 pages from what I saw, and that it's an easy read. And in fact, Richard is a very good writer, and I'm sort of a reluctant reader. In other words, reading big, thick books of dense material that's hard to read is not my preferred mode of entertainment. But I was able to literally zip through it. It's very clear. It's very intriguing. There's a lot of new information in it. So once it does come out, I hope you're going to get a copy and check it out, because there's lots of good stuff in here. Yeah. Richard?
David, yeah, there is one more thing I'd like to say. My work and the work of the Truth Movement kind of run on parallel tracks here.
Yeah.
I was seeking the truth of the wars, what drove them, how they were prosecuted. You folks are looking for the truth of 9/11, and certainly our paths intersect at 9/11. But I guess I have to back up here a little bit and admit to some skepticism. I have felt for years and years and years that those buildings came down by demolition. It was obvious to anybody with an ounce of common sense and eyes to see. But I was kind of suspicious about the controversy and certainly the stigmatism that was being leveled at the Truth Movement. So I was kind of reluctant to get into that very much in the book. I touched on it a little bit. I wanted to make sure that the 9/11 Commission was seen as fraudulent. But not long ago, I guess it's, David, when we got acquainted and when I sent you the book and you got back to me and we had some fine telephone calls and emails and things, that I needed to look more deeply into the Truth Movement. And I did that. I looked at websites. I had a wonderful Zoom meeting with you and Fran. And the more I learned, the more convinced I was, and my conviction now is 100%, that truth needs to be exposed as well.
Mm-hmm.
And in order to finish my story and to maintain its obsession with the truth, only 3 or 4 weeks ago, I sat down and cranked out about 4,500 words of a chapter 10. And chapter 10 is entitled The Truth Movement. And it covers the work you've done. It points out the, what would you say, certainly the stigmatism is apparent there. And I wanted to point that out. A lot of people think they're a bunch of crazies, a bunch of conspiracy theorists, and all that sort of stuff. And I was able, I think in my chapter 10, David, to discredit every single one of those arguments. Mm-hmm. And to make it very clear that the demolition is inarguable. Mm-hmm. So I did want to get that out before we have some more questions. And thank you very much for the work that you folks have done. Marvelous, marvelous work.
Well, my feeling about this intersection is I recognized when I was reading your book that you were definitely looking at this war on terrorism backstory, and that you were not specifically addressing the issues of the engineering type issues about 9/11 and the buildings and all that kind of thing. And I recognized that, and then as we started to talk, I realized that even more. But that didn't really bother me because the two stories are all pretty much, I see at least, the story you're telling is almost like a necessary backdrop for the story that we're uncovering.
Yeah, I agree.
Because if you say that, from our perspective, from the 9/11 Truth Movement side of things, if you're basically saying that the U.S. is fraudulently creating this cover story to give it a rationale for why these buildings came down, that we were attacked by this foreign terrorists and so forth, then we needed to construct that backstory. And so all of this back and forth manipulation, stringing the Taliban along, keeping Osama bin Laden in place, all of that, refusing to arrest him, refusing to have him extradited or assassinated or anything, that was very clearly, in my view, part of the process of creating this cover story. It's part of the cover-up before the event. So from my side, I had no problem integrating your side. Your story, as we originally discussed it, did not really depend on our story. That you saw all this happening just in its own terms. You saw what the Taliban was doing, what the Bush administration was doing for the in relation to the Taliban and so forth. And that didn't necessarily tie in to our work, but I think ultimately the two are joined at the hip. And so I was actually quite intrigued that someone who's done as much research into all of this as you and had a firm grasp on that one side of the story was still open-minded enough to recognize that, you know, there's different approaches. The old story of the blind men trying to describe an elephant, you know? And so you're touching one side of the elephant and we're pulling on its tail or something like that. So anyway, but and then Osama bin Laden is the snake. That's the tail, I guess. But anyway, so I very much appreciate that that melding of the two stories.
Okay, can you hear me? It's
yes,
Karen
is this Karen?
Speaking.
Okay,
yes,
did you have a question for Richard?
I do have a question, thanks. I can't remember the fellow's first name, Kaiser or something, but somebody Muhammad.
Yeah. Kabir Mohammed.
Yes. I just, and so he had, you know, offered bin Laden's body, basically, dead body. I just wanted to know the source of that information, please.
Well, Karen, let me put it this way. I hope this answers your question. The story of the Taliban's willingness to surrender bin Laden's head, I documented that from 14 different sources. And I can read you those sources by email.
Why don't you give us one or two?
One or two? The first time I ran across it was in 2004 in an article called How Bush Was Offered Bin Laden and Blew It, written by Jeffrey St. Clair and Alexander Coburn on Counterpunch, November 1, 2004. That was the first one. That's what provoked my interest in the whole story. I thought that was just the most colossal betrayal
Sorry to interrupt, but was this Muhammad, somebody Muhammad, a member of the Taliban? Now, I'm asking about him, not about the Taliban.
I see.
You made some comments about his...
Kabir Mohammed was not a Taliban member, no.
Okay, so you made some comments about his offering to kill bin Laden and present him in, what was it, rare, medium, or well done, I think you said.
Yes.
That is I'm asking for the source of that information, not to do with the Taliban, but that information.
That information, Karen, came from this unpublished book that I mentioned, a terribly important book. It was a biography, I guess a memoir would be a better word, of Kabir Mohammed's. He didn't write English very well, and so he engaged a woman in Houston, Texas, named Leah McGinnis, a PhD in literature, to, what would you say, transcribe his story into English. That's where that particular episode came from, the business about rare, medium, or well done, verbatim in his book.
Okay, thank
you. My understanding from our earlier conversations was that was in response to his conversations with the Taliban, and when he realized how willing the Taliban was to give him up, that he wasn't offering to kill him. He was basically offering the U.S. State Department to deliver him as an intermediary. Is that correct, Richard?
Well, not quite, David, because Mohammed was not really an active. He was a consultant. He was not a part of the CIA. He was not a part of any national security community. He was not a part of the State Department. But he was an intermediary. He was the courier, let's put it that way, between the U.S. and the Taliban. And we know this in a rather remarkable, maybe even frightening way, that the 9/11 Commission, Philip Zelikow was the director of that, sent a letter to Kabir Mohammed asking him to testify about his relationship negotiating between the Taliban and the U.S.
For the 9/11 Commission.
Before the 9/11 Commission.
And
I went to the archive. The internet is unbelievable. You can punch in a couple of links and you're right in the archives of the 9/11 Commission. And I went right to Kabir Mohammed's folder and I found one single sheet of paper in there with a red border around it. And it said withdrawal notice. The entire contents of this folder have been removed.
So he testified and then it wasn't acceptable to.
That's all I know, David.
Yep.
I think a skeptic would say it was removed and shredded. I can't document that, certainly.
Is your question answered there, Karen?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Karen.
Let's go on. Adam, Adam, there you are. There you are. Adam, answer your question.
Hi, Adam.
Good evening, Mr. Behan. The question would be regarding the surrounding nature of Taliban and Osama bin Laden. After bin Laden was forcibly expelled from the Sudan under the United States and the CIA, he returned to Kandahar, where he had to get permission to remain in lodging from the Taliban's emir, Mohammed Mullah Omar, in which he agreed to. According to Salafi tradition, it is uncustomary to deny another Muslim from entering another country and becoming a guest. But later on, somewhere down this road, Afghanistan was also enduring a civil war between two major factions. That was the Taliban and the Northern Alliance, headed by Ahmed Shah Massoud, a socialist. And it was the CIA who decided to not intervene into the war. But the Taliban had a major funding coming from Pakistan at this point, under Hamad Gul and the ISI. And it was only a due time that the Northern Alliance would become liquidated. However, when bin Laden decided to enter Afghanistan, it is suggested that he wasn't there to commit terrorist actions, but he became a formidable adversary to Mullah Omar on one operation. And on September 9, 2001, 2 days before the September 11th attacks, two al-Qaeda operatives dressed as media intermediaries went to interview Ahmed Shah Massoud, and he was assassinated. And this was not necessarily something that bin Laden may have brought up to Mullah Omar, but it was certainly something that was a reason for bin Laden's stay, if he was to eliminate the Northern Alliance and have Taliban, because Taliban took over the country after that. And so the question would be, is this: was the Taliban's refusal to hand over bin Laden based upon his usefulness regarding eliminating Ahmed Shah Massoud, and knowing full well that the Taliban didn't realize that he was behind or was involved at some point with the 9/11 attacks? So he certainly didn't create the operation, but he was partially funding it.
Is this event, by the way, is this after 9/11 or before?
The assassination of Ahmad Shah Massoud was 2 days before the 9/11 attacks. And I wanted to know if this was partially a reason for bin Laden to remain in Afghanistan, knowing full well that bin Laden was himself going to conduct a terrorist operation without Mullah Omar knowing about it.
I'm going to put the spotlight back here on Richard here a second. Okay, go ahead.
Leave it on Adam, David. I think Adam is far better qualified than I am to answer his own question. That marvelous detail there, Adam. I wish I had access to that or had discovered it. I suppose I did have access and didn't know it. But yeah, that fills in a lot of blank spots. Thank you very much.
Oh, no, thank you.
So part of what Adam just said was that it sounded like he was implying that there was a reluctance to turn over bin Laden, and your basic premise is that there was a willingness to turn over bin Laden. Can you clarify what the two of you are talking about there?
I don't think I can speculate on that, David, except I think Adam would agree that the relationship, how would you put it, the context of Afghanistan is very, very complicated. Yeah. The factions, the warlords, the Taliban, the bin Laden's involvement and all of that. I didn't run into any decent explanation for that, except to discover that it is very complex.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I don't know the timeline here either, Adam. I would say this: the Taliban became incrementally dissatisfied, unhappy with bin Laden's presence as one attack on U.S. property after another took place.
Yeah, I would agree with that, actually. I think they saw him as a tentative ally more than a solid ally at all. More problems than what he was worth.
Okay, let's move on. We have a question from Tom Carlin. I'm going to try and find you here just a second. And Tom, I see you there.
Hi, David.
Hi, here.
I'm here.
Put your hand down. I'm going to spotlight you there. There you go. Go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, Richard.
Hello, Tom.
My question is, do you think that we need another 9/11 investigation? One of the premises early on with the 9/11 Truth Movement was to call for another 9/11 investigation. And I'd like your opinion about whether you think another 9/11 investigation could be called, especially after the November elections, and what direction could it take now that time has passed and good resources like your book have entered the body of literature, which might speak to motive behind 9/11. Can you talk a little bit about how you feel about that, another 9/11 investigation?
Yes. I could leave it there. Indispensable. I'm stuttering for words here, Tom. I just there's so much we don't know. So much has been covered up, and yes, it will take obviously a new government interested in the truth. Whether that is on the horizon or not is anybody's guess. Certainly, the Democrats have been as culpable as the Republicans in ignoring the story. Let's put it that way.
Uh-huh.
And I think probably, I did discover this. I guess I told David this in a phone call. I was astonished at the simple magnitude of the truth movement. Literally hundreds of thousands of people in more than 40 countries. And I think just the size of that chorus of truth seeking will be heard someday. They will not be denied. And let me pose a question, I guess, to you folks in general. My feeling is that the truth movement is growing. It's attracting adherents. Is that correct?
Good question. I mean, I think that it's harder right now, given, all right, there's a lot of sense, well, that's way in the past. And so there's a lot of people who are very pessimistic about us being able to do anything of value because it's so far in the past. My response when I'm asked about that is 9/11 was not an event in the past. It was a turning point, and it's the impact of 9/11, it's felt every single day. And so it's present here and now. Yeah, and it needs to be addressed right now, and it's in terms of all of the lies about 9/11 feed into the rationale that 9/11 is used to you know, cover up everything under the sun and to invade all these countries and everything. So I don't know that a U.S. government investigation is going to materialize, but there are ways for uncovering things besides just through the U.S. government. So I don't have a good sense of that. My personal sense is that doesn't affect my actions. I'm going to continue to do what I do and just sort of like see how this all develops. But maybe others, there's quite a few others here from a variety of perspectives here. Is there somebody else who would like to jump in on that one? Just very briefly. Lots of people.
Can you hear me, David?
I can hear you. Which one are waving?
This is Mike Berger on the phone with 911truth.org.
Mike Berger. Okay, hi. I didn't realize you're on the call, so very good.
Yeah, I've been on since Richard was talking about the pipelines.
Okay.
You know, to me, this call is an example of when you pull on a single thread on this story and you gather all the public record evidence. It's imagine just this little piece going from the Northern Alliance, Afghanistan, the pipelines, how long it takes just to get that narrative out there. And then you look at the immensity and complexity of this event, the precedents, and the consequences. We have always had the evidence on our side. I was just fascinated. I've been working on the site. I found an article on the web from 2003. It was the beginning.
Can I pause a second? You're talking about the site.
Sure.
I don't know if everybody knows him. Mike Berger is the webmaster for the website called 911truth.org, I assume it is?
Yes, it is.
It's one of the oldest 9/11 Truth websites. And anyway, so he's done phenomenal work from way back. So anyway, continue. Sorry.
Thanks, David. So the point is I'm reading this 2003 article, which was written by some of the people who eventually, that was the beginning announcement of 911truth.org. They had a wealth of evidence. The evidence has never been the issue. In my opinion, after looking at this for 17 years now, this is an issue of consciousness and the veil that descends on how much darkness we can tolerate. Because I believe after working on this as long as I have, in my opinion, the challenge is once you present the evidence, you're challenging somebody to ask you what they should do about it. And that's our greatest challenge. That is a difficult question to answer. 15, 16 years ago, I used to tell people they needed to run for office. It's 15 or 16 years later. The system isn't going to allow change. Facts themselves won't change minds. So in my opinion, we need to come up with a response to the question, now that you've woken me up, what would you like me to do? And I guess I'll leave it there. Thank you.
And that's a question for which there is no instant answer. But I'm going to go to another question, which is Rick Witterkind. Is that the way you said it?
Oh, close. Wittekind.
Wittekind. I'm going to spotlight you here. There you go. Go for it.
Oh, okay. I wrote it, but it was what I remember was it's a what if question. What if Gore had won the 2000 election? Would Lieberman have filled the Dick Cheney role? Would 9/11 still have occurred, do you think?
It's hard to see that it would, Rick. I don't think we can, let me put it, I don't want to use the word collective here, we. I can't imagine a more criminal man that we've had as president than George Bush. And I need to point out, by the way, that his action, the war on terror, was not an isolated event. Andrew Bacevich is a marvelous historian, and I read his 3 most recent books fairly recently, and he points out how we have always been an imperial nation. We've always fought wars of conquest and dominion. And we know that in 1980, Jimmy Carter propounded what he called the Carter Doctrine, which meant that we would defend U.S. interests in the Persian Gulf with force if necessary. And that was the beginning, I guess, of George Bush's war, if you want to look at it that way. So, there we are.
Okay, so you're saying that the circumstances for 9/11 were unique to the Bush administration rather than just the general imperial attitude.
Absolutely, David. Yeah, I point out in the book that we've always been an aggressive nation, as they say, imperialist nation. But George Bush's war then was unique only in a number of respects. One is the dishonesty of its presentation, the incompetence of its prosecution, and its utter futility. So there are some unique aspects about the war on terror that don't fit the mold of our history.
Okay.
I think he was an evil man.
Mm-hmm.
And yet today he is a well-respected elder statesman. In the years 2018 and 2019, he was granted 4 different prestigious awards for international leadership and for lifetime achievement and for spreading democracy and liberty around the world. And here he is. This is a post-truth society.
Okay. Karen Schra has another, just a second here, let me switch this over. Can you hear me, Karen?
Yes, I can.
Do you have your video intentionally turned off? Or?
No, it just doesn't work on my computer.
It doesn't. Okay, well, go ahead then and ask your question.
Sorry for that. Could you just help me, please, with how you search for unpublished books on the internet? I don't know how to do that.
You're asking Richard that question?
Yes, I am. Yeah.
Karen, I found that book. How would you put this? Kind of wandering around. I think perhaps I put Kabir Mohabbat's name into the search engine. I don't recall exactly how that happened, but I do remember where I found the link to the book, and that was on a page in Wikipedia.
Okay. Thank you. I'll see what I can find. Thank you.
From our early conversations with Richard and I, we were talking about this, and apparently it's going to be published. This unpublished book is in the process of, it's going to be published by a German publisher, is that correct?
Yes.
Who's going to be simultaneously publishing it, as if I recall, you said in German, English, and Arabic, is that correct?
Uh-huh.
So it's in process. It's not going to stay permanently unpublished, hopefully. But anyway.
No, it's more than in process, David. I talked with Leah McInnes and her husband Garland not more than 2 weeks ago. And they said it is being printed now and they will send me a copy as soon as they have some. So I'm anticipating it momentarily.
Thank you.
So it's further along than I thought. Very good.
Yeah.
Is that sufficient for your answer there, Karen?
Yes, very good. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Karen.
And Fran said she had some questions. Fran's running things in here for me. Meet Fran in the background here. So Adam Fitzgerald and Tom C. Let's go back to them again. Try to get everybody in here. Let me find Adam. Adam, where are you? Did you turn your video off? There you are. All right. Spotlight. Okay, Adam.
Yeah, actually, I didn't have a follow-up, but now that you got me here and forced my hand.
Oh, I just got a note that you needed, you wanted a follow-up. Okay.
Actually, no, actually, while I'm up here, Mr. Behan, could you elaborate a little bit further about the nature of Muhammad's relationship with the United States and bin Laden itself?
Kabir Mohammed's relationship?
Yes. Could you, by the way, could you also spell his first name for me?
It's Kabir.
Okay.
Mohabbat.
ED.
Kabir Mohammed. Yeah.
Okay. Because there's regarding certain Arabic names, whether they be Farsi or Arabic, the Muhammad, the last name is either ED or AD, so there could be a slight variation about the spelling of names, and that's why maybe I think Karen can't find that name on the internet. That could happen.
Mm.
Okay. So that was that question? Okay. And Tom, where are you? There you are.
Okay, I think I'm unmuted. Richard, another question about, in the course of your research, what has been your findings about the Shia and Sunni factions of Islam and how that has affected things in the Middle East and relating to your research on terrorism?
I didn't look into that, Tom. I understand the animosity there goes back 800 years. And what little reading I've done about it, it seems to be insuperable.
Mm-hmm.
Those folks simply don't see, they're shooting past each other, and apparently there's no solution to it.
Yeah, kind of like the old Protestants and Catholics in the Western world.
Or Trumpers and the rest of us.
Okay, thank you.
All right. I'm going to turn to Fran, who said she had a couple of questions herself.
Sure.
Let me set this up.
There
you go.
Hi. So, Richard, I'm still stuck on this. The fact you say that the Chinese and the Russians own the Iraqi oil fields, and the U.S. does not have a pipeline across Afghanistan. I'm flabbergasted. It's like the whole plan, according to your PowerPoint, was for 81% of the oil and gas to go to 2 U.S. oil companies and 2 British oil companies. And now the oil companies of Russia and China own the Iraqi oil fields, and the U.S. doesn't have a pipeline. I'm just totally stuck on that. Can you explain how that happened?
Well, they don't own the oil fields, Fran. That's not a matter of ownership. It's a matter of contracts.
Okay.
And they have contracts. I'm trying to recall in my book the facts that I need to relate to you, the details. It was the minister, how would I put this? The head of the Ministry of Oil in Iraq spoke to an American consultant named Gary Vogler, and Gary wrote a book about oil in Iraq. And the minister said to Gary, if it was if it was America's purpose to capture the value of the Iraqi oil fields, you did a lousy job. He said most of it now is going to Russia and Chinese companies. That's pretty close to a verbatim quote, and that's about all I know about it. I did look into, I found an Iraqi English language article about who is operating in the Iraqi oil fields today. And as I recall, it was 15 or 20 different nations: Norway, France, Mexico. I could cite them for you if I looked at the text in the book, but and only two very, very insignificant American companies. One of them might be Bush's old Arbusto oil company that Bush had. I don't know if that's the case or not, but the American presence is essentially negligible in the Iraqi oil fields. And the difficulty in Iraq is that the country is far too volatile, far too toxic, far too unstable for anyone to invest in pipeline construction there. The opportunity remains. The opportunity was the immense quantities of oil and gas in the Caspian Basin, but they're locked away from the world's markets, and the closest and shortest access to those markets is through Afghanistan and Pakistan. That was the oil. That was Unical's plan, was to monopolize, in essence, the transport of Caspian Basin resources.
So the U.S. government spent all that money to to basically take control of the oil and gas, and now they don't have the pipeline in Afghanistan or the oil and gas, much of it in Iraq. I'm just amazed. You would think that would be high priority for them to have that. So I'm still stuck on this, how that could be possibly true, and we're still in those countries. I mean, as you pointed out in your PowerPoint, the Iraqi embassy is 10 times larger than any other embassy anywhere in the world. Mm-hmm. We spent all that money to do that, and we've killed so many people. And we don't even have the resources that the U.S. corporations and the British corporations wanted. It's still an amazing thing to hear, you know.
This is the way I describe it, Fran. The intended wars were epic failures. The fraudulent war continues. Now, there's a whole lot of reasons about the fraudulent war continuing. One of which I think you pointed out to me in an email is the stranglehold that corporate interests have on the American government. And certainly the military-industrial complex profits immensely from the continuation of these wars. Yep. That $6.4 million had to go somewhere.
Yep. So are you saying this is from the corporations who manufacture weapons? Mm-hmm. They're profiting.
Sure.
Is that what you're saying? Yeah. So there is profit going on even if they don't have access to the oil or the pipeline.
Somebody is benefiting from the war.
Yeah. And they don't want to get out of there. I mean, it's just amazing.
I think Obama continued the war. As a matter of fact, he expanded. Yeah. He sent 30,000 more troops to Afghanistan.
Yeah.
But here's, I think, kind of an ideological dilemma. How could anybody... Well, let me back up and say this. The rational response to a lost war is to bring the troops home and get out, to admit defeat and leave.
Yeah.
But that couldn't be done without exposing the fraud. And no one's been willing to do that.
Okay, I have another question.
Sure.
So this is on a different subject. So in your PowerPoint, I was, of course, reading that the Taliban wanted to maintain this good relationship with the U.S., and they wanted to remove the rock in the road, which was Osama bin Laden, in order to have that good relationship. So they were very invested in this, and yet there was the Argentinian company Brightus oil company, and they were not willing to cancel their agreement with Brighton as the U.S. wanted, and they were very stubborn on that.
Yes, they were.
Do you have any? They were very, very reluctant. They didn't do it. They were very stubborn. Why did the Taliban? Why were they so reluctant to cancel their relationship with the Brightus Argentinian oil and gas company? if they were so desperate to keep relationships with the U.S.?
Excellent question, and I wish I had an answer to that. It occurred to me as I was writing the book. That seems kind of odd. And I looked into it some, but didn't pursue it, that particular angle. I can speculate, I guess, that the relationship was very, very complicated because the Northern Alliance had also signed that contract with Brightest. They had signatures from both the Taliban and the Northern Alliance. General Dostum was the fellow that signed the contract with Brightest. And there might have been some dynamic there between the Taliban and the Northern Alliance that they didn't want to give them any advantage, or I don't know. It's a complicated thing. But an excellent unanswered question to this day. The fact is they didn't. They wouldn't budge. And the last meeting between the Taliban and the State Department people was in Berlin in August of 2001, in which Christine Roca, the State Department negotiator, said this: either accept our offer of a carpet of gold, or we will drop a carpet of bombs. Mm-hmm. And the offer of gold was a matter of a foreign aid package that the Bush administration was trying to entice the Taliban with in order to cancel the Brightest contract. And of course, on October 7th, the carpet of bombs fell.
Okay,
David,
I think, yes.
David, I
Yes.
think Mary Ann Jansen, do you still have a question?
Okay, go ahead.
First of all, I want to thank you for making your PowerPoint available for all of us to review before. That was very helpful.
Thank you.
And as I listened to you, what you described to me is almost reminiscent of what occurred for over a period of centuries in Africa with colonialism and a lot of the European countries moving in to get their resources. And there's a new form of neocolonialism going on in Africa right now, and China's involved in a lot of that, tapping into resources and giving very little back to the country. In fact, one of the reasons that a lot of the African countries enjoy working with China is because they don't require they're such a feudal country, they don't require any paper tracks. And so as long as the leader of any particular African country gets paid off and there's so much corruption going on that they're willing to negotiate. But this almost sounds like, I mean, I hate to think about the US being a colonialist country, but we have been in very deceptive sort of ways. And this sounds to me like a form of neocolonialism where most of the other countries were invited to the party to tap into the oil fields, and we were left out. And so it was like Bush was just, and Cheney were just saying, well, we'll show you, we'll make sure that we get to this party. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely makes sense. Certainly. Perfect sense. Mary Ann, let me suggest that you look at one of Andrew Bacevich's books in particular called The War for the Greater Middle East. And you were almost quoting him, as a matter of fact.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I think you'd really enjoy that book.
And who was the author of that again?
Andrew Bacevich, Bacevich.
Thank you.
He's a military historian and professor emeritus at Boston University. Marvelous writer and excellent thinking.
Okay,
well, I always felt like,
excuse me.
I always felt like there was something fishy going on. It didn't make any sense, and you really have helped me connect all the dots.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Fran said she had a couple more to ask. Let me put her back on. You're in there, Fran.
Okay.
Okay. So it's one of my questions I'd emailed you, Richard. and that is it's attributed to Mussolini. May not have been he who actually said this, but that fascism is corporatism, and that's when the government and corporations merge together. So looking at how this whole fraudulent war happened and how much the oil and gas companies were part of making that happen, would you say that we have corporatism in this country and that this country is then basically a fascist country? And certainly an empire. And then I guess along with that, another question related, which is we have both the Democrats and the Republicans supporting empire and killing millions of people for empire. Is there any way out of this?
Well, I certainly agree with you on your point there, Fran, that we have become a fascist government and have been, at least in my judgment, in my reading, since the administration of Ronald Reagan.
Exactly.
He, and almost without question, we have been a fascist nation since the corporate influence, let me put it this way, since campaign financing has been captured by American corporations.
Mm-hmm.
That is the structural event that leads us where we are today. There was an excellent study done by a couple of political scientists, one was at Northwestern University, and I can send you the citation on this, it skips my mind right now. But they did a study of 2,000 public policy issues. Who proposed it, who benefited? And without exception, American people, the men on the street, the women on the street, were not involved, and they didn't benefit. Major corporations were involved, and they did benefit. And this goes on today. And as you say, it's a matter of both parties. We need, well, let me put it maybe in harsh terms. As this goes forward, it will only be solved by revolution. Now, the revolution can be a peaceful revolution, and I think, in my judgment, a peaceful revolution is precisely what Senator Sanders was talking about. Or it can be a violent revolution. And now let me quote Robert Kennedy. Those who make peaceful revolution impossible make violent revolution inevitable.
Mm-hmm.
I think we're at a very, very serious crossroads in our country.
Exactly.
Okay, let's draw this to a close. We have gone full term, I think, on this. Just a second here. Anyway, I want to thank Richard Behan, and I think we had quite a good expose of this upcoming book. As far as people being able to get a hold of it, it's not published yet, so that's problematic. But once it is, I'm sure you're going to let us know, and we can post, like on the Colorado 9/11 Truth website and perhaps other websites that are, we'll try and get the word out that this is a good resource for understanding the backstory.
Thank you, David. Thank you very
And
much.
I just wanted to express our appreciation. I think all of us share that. I think it was an excellent session tonight. So thank you, and thank you everyone who came. Here, I'll go ahead and display it. You may all wave.
Hey, David.
I was impressed by the quality of the questions, the dialogue, and how deeply all of you have been thinking about this question. Marty, you had a question?
Well, Karen had a question about how people can access the recording of the session afterward.
Oh, yes. I'll be taking the recording of the session, assuming everything went as planned. And I'll have to edit it down because there's transitional little things in it. And then I'll post it in a variety of places, okay? It'll be available at least on the Colorado 9/11 Truth website. Mike, are you there? Still? Mike Berger? I'm sure it'll be posted on the 9/11 Truth website.
I am here.
I'm sure this will, the video of this will probably be posted on your site as well. Is that correct?
Yeah, send me whatever you'd like posted. Be happy to.
Yeah, and so forth. So there are a variety of places. If you haven't visited 911truth.org, it's an old website for the movement, but it's continually updated and maintained, and Mike does a phenomenal job.
David, be sure everyone realizes to be sure you're signed up to receive emails from Colorado Truth, Colorado 911truth.org. Be sure you get our emails, go and subscribe, and we'll be sure to get an announcement out about this video once it's published.
Okay. And it'll be on YouTube and then embedded in various places, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Okay, with that, let's say good night, and thank you again, Richard, and thank you everybody for attending and bringing your very well thought out discussion to this. It's more than just questions. It was a two-way discussion. I think it was quite a remarkable event. Thank you all.